State of nature, the concern for environment. In fact, frankly speaking, like I must confess that since we arrived yesterday, and then among us, like the panelists and who were there, like together in the hotel, our immediate concern was basically the air conditioners. You know, whenever we met, like actually in the lobby in the hotel, and yesterday also in the club, so we were talking about that immediate environment, how cold it was. So we were discussing about that, like what are the laws of this, like working, the ACs work in that way. Now coming to the point, like I'm basically a filmmaker and then have been working for many years trying to track kind of working with indigenous people and trying to look at their kind of practices. And specifically for the last few years, I'm trying to kind of look at their food practices. And then thinking about that, like that through today's presentation is basically what I'll try to using their food practices to understand their connection to nature and then many other aspects in their society. And let me, in the beginning itself, like though there are debates about this definition of indigenous people, but let me kind of place some of the facts in the beginning. It might help to kind of understand few things. The indigenous peoples, or Adivashis, or the tribals, constitute around 8.6% of India's population. In total, 104 million. A large number among them live in a close proximity to nature, on the mountains, in and around forests, or along the rivers. In the Constitution of India, Adivashis are categorized as scheduled tribes. Among them, some groups are identified as primitive tribes, and some are particularly vulnerable tribal groups or PVTGs. Now, let me begin with a kind of an experience which I gathered during shooting of a film on the indigenous food practices in Jharkhand. We were there in an Orao community village, 40 kilometers away from the main city of Jharkhand, Ranchi. And then in the morning when we reached there, they were celebrating Sarul festival. But in the morning, under a shal tree, there was a brief ritual, and immediately after that, there were lots of drinking and dancing. And in between, what I did, like I approached a man of like around 60, 65, and then interviewed him. And this man, Mangrat Anna Bhagat, had told me, Sarul is a ritual to worship the soil, earth. Since time immemorial, we have been worshipping the soil and the shal tree. Unless and until it's done, we won't eat the new seasonal fruits, flowers or herbs. No one can eat. Once Sarul is over, we will start eating bar, pipar and other seasonal fruits and flowers and collect leaves that we eat. We worship the shal tree. At the same time, we also eat its seeds, which has medicinal values. They increase our digestive powers. What will happen if anyone eats those things before Sarul? I asked. Promptly he answered, no one will eat. It's forbidden. Even if anyone eats those before Sarul, will fall sick. Bad things will happen. Whatever you may think, it's a taboo laid by superstition or lack of scientific knowledge, but there lie the deep understandings of nature's principles. Hidden there are the codes of how and when to extract natural resources, and the signs of attachment to Mother Earth, as they call it. Sarul actually happens in March, after the dry winter season, in spring, when the new leaves come, and also this restriction is basically to allow the tree to gain some strength, the new leaves to grow a little more, and the fruits to mature. The message is very clear. Don't extract all the time. Exercise restraint and keep a gap. Minimum of resources. This is an approach which gave birth to a season-dependent, availability-based dietary practices, which is not so much about what we call delicacy. Yes, Adivashis know that they have to extract things from nature, but with care, with respect, and it has to be a mutual relationship. Nature shouldn't be hurt. Otherwise, they themselves will starve eventually. It's their collective wisdom, knowledge that they have been practicing for centuries. In the course of making films on indigenous communities and their practices, what I realized that food is an effective gateway to understand their connections to nature. It also allows to look at very other aspects of their societies. And since the early hunting-gathering days, nature has been the primary reservoir of food for most of the Adivashi communities. By following traditional food practices, one can see many other aspects, starting from belief systems, their sustainable management of natural resources, to festivities and cultural creations. Many of the festivals celebrate food and its resources. They celebrate sowing, procreation, harvest, domesticated animals, forest, rivers, mountains, and propagate the norms of restrained use of their food and other natural resources. If you look at their collective dance moves carefully, you will be reminded of husking of rice, the swinging actions in the field during the harvest, hunting in groups, and movements of many animals. In all the cultural activities of Adivashis, what remains central is nature, which gave them sustenance. By interacting with nature regularly, they have gained the knowledge of managing nature's resources in a sustainable manner. Let me now refer to a small segment from another interview that I recorded for my film. I was following a group of villagers while they were foraging inside a forest. After a point, a young man showed me what all he had collected. These are geti roots. It has to be boiled for a long time. First we peel the skins, then chop in slices. Then they have to be soaked in the river throughout the day. In the evening, we take them out and boil them and eat. Then he shows me a handful of tubers that he digged out. These are kanda, which are to be boiled only for an hour. We can then eat them. While collecting, we take only a portion and leave out the rest. If I take everything, then it won't regenerate. We will get nothing in the coming year. That's why you have to leave some bits. As soon as they get rainwater, they will start growing again. Such a basic functional knowledge. But on the other hand, if you look at it, like it comes as a kind of profound in terms of resourcing, managing natural resources. The most important thing is that this practice is still very much integral to their everyday, daily life. Also look at their tradition of maintaining sacred groves. In every village or in its vicinity, they preserve, or they at least one patch of forest which is completely dedicated to their village gods or goddesses. And exploiting natural resources from a sacred grove is forbidden. Clearly, it's another way of protecting and preserving natural habitats. It's a tradition that is coded in their belief system. But all these are fading. Their practices, knowledge, habitats. Now, when we have started talking more and more about organic, go with nature, eco-friendly, and so on, what about indigenous practices? And the knowledge which for thousands of years have been going hand in hand with nature, had they received any respect or due recognition? Are they taken seriously? The answer is unfortunately no. Indian polity at large is still indifferent to their knowledge. Their food practices are outside the notion of so-called Indian food. Even in the theoretical discourse of Indian food, these are just footnotes. Let me now give you an example of how, in general, Adivashis, who are kind of the proverbial others in our society, are treated in this country. In Kashipur region in Orissa, an Adivasi community, Joria Porja, lost their scheduled tribe status for paving way to set up an aluminium factory. Since Adivasi lands are not for sale under constitutional directive, that particular action was much needed in order to grab their lands. There were protests, demonstrations, and as predicted, police opened fire on them. People have died. Since 2001, Jorias from that region have been pursuing their demand to get back the scheduled tribe status. Now, this is one example, like let me narrate a very strange experience which I gathered during following the food practices in the northeast, high up in Arunachal, in West Arunachal, a place called Zimithang, where I went with my team, and then we have been hosted by a kind of an NGO, and then there was a person who was cooking for us. On the second day, I realized actually that he was cooking canned foods. And I was like, because I never had canned food, that was the first time that he was cooking tuna, he was cooking kind of canned peas and everything. And then I asked them, and I realized that that's quite a prevalent practice there. And interestingly, you have to see that that is a bordering region with Bhutan and Tibet, and heavily patrolled, and there is a concentration of military army. What happened, basically it is very interesting that the idea of armed forces, what we know in other places, it is contrary here. Is basically they are very cordial to these people. And with that generosity, what they do, they open their canteen sometime and then either sell those canned foods to the villagers in a very cheap, very little money. Sometimes they also give free. They serve free tea also. And then often those canned foods were kind of past the dates, like the expiry dates. So these I found very interesting, and then slowly I figured out what is happening, and also not only that military army and also the border road security, border road organization, BRO, are providing them lots of work, daily wage laborers work, because of that military needs to build bunkers, God knows for what reason, because I figured out asking the villagers, they don't have any clue. They build bunkers everywhere. They build walls. They build many other things, and also constant, and also gardening. Gardening is a huge part in these military camps. So, and also the border security, border road organization gives work. What is happening now, Arunachal, which is kind of famous in the world for that knowledge of the people of a kind of growing paddy in the hill slope. Now they are not interested, largely not interested about farming. They are opting for that easy option of daily wage laborer in that area. One can say that it's fantastic, but because it's people have the choice to do that way because it's quick money. But what is happening in result? One thing is that food practices has changed because of that, and also another thing is basically that they are kind of abandoning farming. So they were if you go there, they will see kind of fallow lands, there's kind of bushes and all this. What's happening because of that, this whole landscape is changing, the habitat is changing, and it's also impacting the pattern of migratory birds and all this. So now I come to the kind of one information at this juncture. Let me point to a stark reality. India is officially claimed to be self-sufficient in food production. When we have the highest number of hungry people on earth, and a large number among them are Adivashis, nearly 47% of our children are malnourished. 1 million children under the age of 5 die every year. When this is our reality, can we afford Adivashi practices and knowledge to fade with the changing time? Underdevelopment, aggression, mindless governmental policies, or due to neglect and disrespect? Isn't there anything to be learned from the indigenous people? Unfortunately, we are witnessing the opposite situation. Situation doesn't appear to be promising at all. By issuing an act like Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act and redesigning the Forest Rights Act, Indian government is now trying to take more control over forest lands, Adivashi habitats. Quickly, in brief, Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act gives government an authority to acquire Adivashi lands inside reserve forest or protected areas, and allot those for non-forest use, setting up development projects. Clearing of forest will be compensated by planting new trees in some other lands. Government will collect levies from each development project, and a fund will be generated which will be monitored and managed by an authority, CAMPA. That money will be used for afforestation, maintenance of forests, and so on. And definitely the forest department of the government will have a significant role in all these activities. Are we to believe that forests which are there for hundreds of years can be replaced by planting new trees? That too by doing monoculture tree plantations, which forest department generally propagates? And what about governmental bureaucratic tangle, the role of notoriously corrupt forest department? Rather than me commenting on this, let me conclude by reading from another man's interview. Listen to what Mahabir Paraya, an Adivashi from Jharkhand, had to say. Many of our gods and goddesses reside here, inside the forest, 307 of them, Pachari Devi, Maharani, Budi Mai, Jangal Karakshel, and many more. They protect us. We do farming and collect so many things from the forest. This is our forest. We worship and obey all the gods and goddesses who reside here. We also maintain our forest. The forest department gives a damn about all this. What claim can they have on this forest or our land and rivers then? Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open. Okay, let me break the ice with a question. So, Nilanjan, would you say that initially you talked of how there's that even though indigenous groups take from nature, they have a different attitude of taking than other parts of the world where one takes from nature. So there's some sense that you don't take from nature with impunity, right? So where does the non-impunity consist in? And I think your point was that there are but let's explore the sorts of things that came out from what you said for why it is not taking with impunity when they take from nature. You know, when they, in cycles of planting, maybe even cycles of hunting. So would you say that it takes the form, so there may be rituals of reciprocation, of showing respect, restoration of what you're taking in some sense through rituals of that kind. Would you say those are all expressing a sense of debt? Is that the right way to think of how it's not impunity? Is that there's a feeling of gratitude and debt which makes it different?
Absolutely, absolutely. Like initially, who was talking about Bono Bibi's reference came up, like in Sundarbans, the goddess of the forest. Just go by that, like that. In Sundarbans, the people enter the forest either collecting honey or collecting fuel wood or whatever reasons. They have to worship Bono Bibi, and in every place, like if you see. In the tribal areas, if before collecting anything from the forest, they will pray. They say that, like, I'm indebted to, literally they say that I am indebted to you, Mother Nature, Mother Earth, and I'm taking this from you, and then please protect us, don't mind anything, and then we will be nice to you. that there is a huge date, like the sense of, you can say it's also part of the belief system, which we always call it like kind of superstition, but like also the ecologist has called as kind of conservation ethics. So whatever you call it, but it's very much there.
Yes.
That was really wonderful, thank you. I had a question about, it speaks a little bit to Shibani's point of rights of and rights to, and the danger in some ways of the sort of the value of the values in indigenous knowledges, and what you're talking about, like this return to or embracing of indigenous knowledge. But there is a danger that rather than the sort of indebtedness or values, that looking at what might be returned to is much more the recipe, for example, for a medicinal plant that can be packaged and sold at Fab India. Or do you understand what I'm trying to say? Like, what is the difference between so the value of how we are indebted to nature and what the seeds of a particular plant can do, and how that can become a sort of be taken away from that and seen as, oh, this is indigenous and this is good, but really it is being sold in a neoliberal market.
You know, frankly speaking, that I'm not in a position to recommend anything. These are my observations, and it's a hugely complex issue. In terms of kind of property rights, and there are lots of debate going on. And also, if you look at this whole thing, there was a debate, like Ravi will know very well, I think, about biodiversity registers. And there were kind of groups that, like, which Professor Madhav Gadgil and others, who were kind of proposing to every village should have their biodiversity register. I also worked closely a little bit, like long ago, through a film. But another was like saying that, like, if you already have a kind of a register, even in the village, then this is a ready material to come and pick it up. But when you say that, but at the same time you have to remember that the incidents are happening already. So no matter you have register or not, people are picking up stuff. But my whole intention, or the intention for my practice, and I would say kind of curious examination, is basically I want these to be discussed. And they should be given respect. And then while we are talking about all these things as if they don't exist, they only feature in the organic shop or as sold as a kind of a very exclusive product. No, they have to be, and you are, I don't want to get into this, but you are constantly like this idea of India, and then you are excluding their food practices totally. And then you constantly talk about India, and so the India can be questioned from many other angles also. So they should be brought in and then discussed. There are problems also in their societies. It's not that everything is great.
Okay, I see three hands. Ravi, Bernd, and then you at the back. Yeah.
Recently I had a chance to talk or witness some kind of conversation with some Amerindian tribes, and they say exactly the same thing about explicitly speaking and begging forgiveness before the take from nature. And so there's some commonality. You talk across groups across the world, and you find very similar language of gratitude, of indebtedness. Including in Australia, you find very similar language. So I'm just want to think about that. I don't know what it means. And also in many practices, ritual practices, for example, when you pray to the snake, to the Nag Panchami, you feed. There are many practices where you give back to, or you will not hurt animals, and you feed the animals, even poisonous snakes, for example. So is there something which joins these things, like when we think of a global modernity at the other end, is there something which joins this kind of thinking? And these are, obviously the Amerindian tribes have not communicated with.
But I think, means in my limited knowledge, like, and also as a kind of, from the practice itself, like that, if you see, you will find so much similarity in their kind of the way many parts in the world, like the tribals, the indigenous people dance, their music. Then I remember that I was looking for music to use for the trailer, and then if I wanted to use some Middle Africa music sounded exactly like similar, and there was a record I had like kind of using everyday sound as music. I thought, oh my God, like this is exactly in Odisha where I'm working, because you hear the sounds of pigs, the children, something falling and all this. So there is a certain, because I think because they all worship nature. They all are indebted to nature. They all are constantly in interaction with nature. So in that case, in totality, nature works as a kind of global, as a whole planet.
Bewildering to think of this global scale of this commonality, and I very much understand
it. When you have a community with the attitudes you described towards nature, nevertheless, I imagine that there also ecological violence takes place sometimes. So my question would be, are there, let's say, what we would call legal procedures within the community to deal with these kind of violations? And how would they relate, let's say, to the national legal system? When would the national come in, and where it can be dealt with in the community procedures?
Yeah, well, there's two layers. You said that, like in the local level. Local level that I didn't mention, actually, Adivashis have their local institutions, which is little different from what we understand as administration. As far as I understood, it works very much on idea of collective consensus. It's not majority democracy there. It's largely consensus things. Like, for example, like I remember that it's always, if you plan to fix a schedule, it's difficult because the festival dates are in a certain period they will do. Say within 1.5 months they will have that festival, but it's not every year it's not the same date. It will be dependent on talking to everyone. The authorities will sit, the local authorities, and then they will look for, if it's a harvest festival, they will look for, oh, everyone has the harvest. Then only we'll have the festival, and in consensus we'll decide that. Say 5 families don't have harvest yet, so the society will wait, the village authority will wait for that and then decide with a consensus. So there are ways, but again, like the situation is that like that is also breaking. That's one level. Second thing, respond to government thing. That's long chapter. You have to see there are movements like Chipko and others. And now, if you read this, basically response is also violence. Response is terrorism, and then response is extremism, Maoism. There is no other way, there is no negotiation, because this gap I'm talking about, this is totally like completely big. There is no bridge there like that where administration in a cordial way talk to their issues or something. So it's conflicting.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Nilanjan Mukul here. Thanks for a very interesting paper. I was wondering that, look, when we talk about tribals or indigenous population, there is also indigenous politics. There is also a strong indigenous identity. You take Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand. I come from Jharkhand. So, of course, there are many external factor of a state or capital and industry. Do you see any kind of interaction between this indigenous politics with these tribal beliefs, practices, and how do you see that interaction? Take, for example, Jharkhand, and you mentioned about Sarhul and Sarna and sacred groves. Now, the indigenous politics in Jharkhand, be the NGO or civil society or political parties or the state, have taken Sarhul in a big manner. Sarhul is a public holiday. It's being celebrated by all the political parties and civil society organizations. It continues for days and days together, funded by various kind of fund. Even the traditional tribal leader, Pahan, you must have met with Pahan, they take funds from these political parties. So how do you see these many influences, which is coming from within, not from outside, influencing the so-called sacral politics of tribals or their tradition and behavior? That is one. Second, just to add to my first point, you mentioned about sacred groves, and you rightly mentioned that not everything is fine with the tribal culture, there might be problem. So now, I have done field work extensively in sacred groves, Jharkhand. In the past 3 months, it's recent. So, Jharkhand sacred grove, which is so much celebrated and written about, does not allow women to participate in the customs. Jharkhand sacred groves does not allow the Dalit population to participate in the practice. Jharkhand sacred groves, and Jharkhand, we all know that 40% is the tribal population and 6 non-tribal, does not allow non-tribals to be part of the sacred groves managing committee. So how do you see these many factors interacting with many indigenous practices in Jharkhand and otherwise?
Yeah, but quickly, because it's also again a very complicated issue, and also I don't know everything in that sense. But quickly, as you said, that the things coming from inside, it's not necessarily always like that. Because if you look at like that tribal leader is being purchased, is not coming from inside. It's coming from outside. And Jharkhand is a right example. All the tribal leaders have the biggest scam going into power. So obviously I'm not saying they are the most pure people, but it's also, you have to see from the both sides at this, as you was mentioning, also looking at from inside. Say for example, there are influences in Orissa. I remember that I had to cancel a shooting, or there is a particular date fixed, and I went there in Orissa and with my team, and when I arrived there next day, they told me that, oh, the Pahan, they say the head of the village, has yesterday has dreamt that like that Devi, that goddess has come in his dream and suggested that that day you can't have that festival this year. But then I said, okay, but then I had to wait for, and Devi also apparently gave a date, like 1 week later. And then I waited there, and then I realized, and everyone was saying, oh, it's also after that day, after that puja, we will go to another temple opening of us. Then I said, temple opening? How can the temple opening for Adivashis? They said, no, we also have to go there, we have been told, and we will do that. The entire community almost. Then I figured out there was a Vishnu or Shiva temple opening along the road. So who do you blame? So there are very complicated and very clever politics going on there. And also if you look at, like, I don't want to bring this Christianization and all these issues, in the Northeast, this sacred groves has been totally kind of degenerated because of all these things. So it's not always things. It's going on for many years.